You once said you have a father who was like the father in Boys in the Hood. Now that you're older, looking back on it, how much of a blessing was it to have someone that taught you and protected you and held you accountable?
It's a big blessing, having my dad in my life, all my life. It's also a privilege as well, in the environment and area that I grew up in. I didn't really recognize it at the time, but I was one of the few in the area that I lived that had a household that had both mum and dad. So, having that discipline, having that male energy, that kind of shaped the way in which I think and feel and respond to issues that were going on whilst I was growing up, for me was a big blessing. And I think that those teachings that my dad gave me that would have been passed down from his both mum and dad, right, that also was in his life, he created a kind of system around responsibility of me as a young man. And I guess now me being older, that's why I push so much even in the world of my children, being around them and being consistent, and showing them the importance. And I think there's one thing that when you mentioned my dad, there's one thing that stuck out for me is parents' evenings at school. My dad used to always make sure he was present at parents' evening. And he used to say, he's fighting the stereotype. And I never thought about it like that. And I think now I'm an adult in education and working with the community and working with families. Sometimes the mother plays a significant role and always being the face of school and education and whatnot. And it's interesting because in parents' evening, I always predominantly used to always see mothers, aunties, grandma, nan, that would always attend on behalf of their children. And I wouldn't see fathers. And that may not necessarily because they're absent. It may be because they're busy or they're doing what they need to do. But I found myself doing the same thing that my dad did. Always was present at the nursery, always present at school, because I wanted to demonstrate also to the systems that judge us, that also fight against us, to demonstrate I was a consistent black male in the life of my young black children.
That's interesting, yeah. So in fighting the stereotype that the system may see, although that may not have been the only thing in his head, but in doing that, it also supported you in a profound way because you remember that stuck with you as well. Yeah, that's interesting.
And then in a weird way, it taught me about responsibility, what my role is, what my role should be, what my challenges are going to be, and what I need to do in order to face those challenges. One of the things that was very significant in my upbringing and what my dad used to always say to me is he used to bring me into his kind of space where he used to do his, because he was a painting and decorator. And he always used to show me his two hands, and he always used to say that, look at my hands. Then he'd tell me to put on my hands as well. And I'm thinking, like, what am I looking at my hands for? He said, what's the difference between my hands and your hands? And obviously your hands are bigger because you're a grown man. But what he said was, look at them. And I was like, they got paint on them. They look like they've been through some wear and tear. And he said that he doesn't want my hands to be like his hands. He wants me to use this. And that's why he pushed me into education so much. So I went to Saturday school. I had extra education. Don't know how they afforded it, but I had that extra education. And whilst I seen it as a burden or a chore, when I was growing up, whilst my friends were playing outside and having fun, that it seemed like I was, a boring life. Now, when I think about my life, as a grown adult, I realize that importance and why I pursue education so much and why I'm so passionate about the things that I do, because a lot of that was instilled in me from a young age, just from that little activity of my dad holding up his hands.
Speaking about the importance that your father played in your life, is it unrealistic to expect a man to behave like a man if he's never been taught or guided by one?
It's a complex question because I think that it's nuanced and I think it's complex. Because when you talk about what is a man, that can mean many things to many people in different spaces and time. So my understanding of a man, I guess when I was growing up into adulthood, is that, you know, dad was the provider. My granddad was the provider. He'd work all day, he'd come back, he'd do his thing. Mum would have her responsibilities and they would just work in harmony. And I guess growing up, those aspects of culture, those things that I witnessed my dad doing, the interactions my dad would have with mum and how he would be with us, you know, very staunch, very, you know, authority, discipline, those things were passed into to me. So when I think about my own children, and especially my young boys, you know, I try to instill those things as well. So that understanding of, well, what is a man? I like to use the word, you know, responsibility. I like to use the word honor. I like to use the word humility. I like to use the word compassion. And I also like to use the word emotionally intelligent, because I think my dad was emotionally intelligent. You know, my dad was very much, you know, a warrior, but he would also know how to be very calm. So when he's dealing with my mum's emotions or he's dealing with the emotions of, you know, family members or whatnot, he was always very calm. But I used to always think with us, he'd give us, you know, that strong level of discipline. But it makes perfect sense. And I always say that, you know, as young men, and I talk about this quite a lot with my work, is that, you know what, we should be dangerous. But I think the high level of morality is being able to control that level of danger. And it's just like martial arts. You know, we go out and we taught how to be dangerous, but we know how to control it. And I think that those little things in which my dad was teaching me, along with his brothers, along with my granddad, I think that shaped the way in which I see manhood and the way in which I want to, I guess, continue that legacy of teaching through my own children.
That's very interesting. Yeah, very interesting perspective. So what does real mentorship look like? Can you explain how the breakdown of family structures in the community actually strengthens the appeal and power of gangs?
It's an interesting topic. I guess as a criminologist, these are one of the things that I oftentimes try to make sense of. And if I guess, take away just my hat as an academic and I think about my frontline experiences, when I often used to work within the local community and work with predominantly young males, young black males, many of them came from what we would call dysfunctional households, where mum and dad wasn't present. They may have had an older sibling that was incarcerated. They may have had younger siblings that were getting into trouble at school. They themselves were struggling within the education system. But somehow they was able to function. And that power and that resilience oftentimes led into communities becoming somewhat hostile to externals wanting to help. And when I think about those young men that I oftentimes used to work with that were coming from those particular backgrounds, there was this kind of need to want to be aligned with other individuals that may have reflected the absence of dad, the absence of older brother, the absence of older cousin. And if you think then in the tight-knit communities that exist, the friends that you go to school with, the individuals that you play football with, the individuals that you may meet on the weekends for a number of things, then become the surrogate family. So we use the word gang quite flippantly, and I have to be very conscious when I use the word gang because it's oftentimes gendered and it's also racialized, and it also has negative connotations to suggest that all young people that join gangs for the reason to be involved in criminal activity. But because you use the word family, I think it's important that we understand what sometimes groups, without using the term gangs, are. and they are surrogate families. And if you think of the basic needs that every human being needs, whether that is food, sustenance, whether that is safety, whether that is the ability to be seen and to be heard, to be respected, to understand one's purpose, all of those things become really important. So if you've got a level of dysfunctionality that exists within a household, within a community, and your group and your peers are able to somehow sustain you because they can give you money, whether that is illegal or illegal, whether someone can give you protection because there's a worry or a fear within the community because someone might harm me. So it means that I need to hang around with these groups of people. You may get a level of respect because you're not seen within the wider society as somebody that is valid within the community, because you're always seen as this alien or you're marginalized within a particular community. This group may give you validation because they'll be like, you know what, we respect you, we like you because you're able to do these things. And then some of our young people find purpose in the behaviors and activities that exist within that group. So now when we apply the word gang, you may have individuals within that group that are exploiting each other. You may have individuals that target young people within their community. You may have individuals within those particular groups that are doing really well because they use illegal means in order to get money, to get material things. So the appeal to get that within some particular environment seems like the pinnacle of where children and young people want to attain. Now, the problem is that there's many individuals like myself that work, that are doing amazing things. There are many individuals that are within the education sector, within social care, within mental health, that are doctors, that are lawyers, that are accountants, but they're not visible. And because they're not visible, when we talk about that pinnacle, that individual or group of people that people aspire to, oftentimes they're doing negative things. So that dysfunctionality oftentimes exists within local communities because there is a lack of role models, there is a lack of identity, there is a lack of unity, there is a lack of community. We talk about community a lot, which is interesting, but a lot of our young people don't feel part of the community. And oftentimes the communities in which they exist or coexist are oftentimes led by individuals and groups that don't see those young people as being part of the community. So then young people then become isolated and they develop groups within community that they oftentimes call the group, the gang, the man-dem, and that's oftentimes what happens.
You once said that families don't know how to be families anymore. Can you speak a bit on that, what you meant by that?
When I talk a lot in my, sorry, let me come back again. One of the things I talk a lot about in my research is the families of yesterday versus the families of today. Traditional families, contemporary families. And if we think about when we were growing up, one of the things I oftentimes talk about is that there was that kind of notion of extended family. So when I grow up, I always have memories when I close my eyes and I think about always being at my nan's house, always being at my auntie's house and just being surrounded by my cousins. I grew up with my cousins and they were just like my siblings. Right. You know, I remember being in a small room and there was like 7 of us. How we all slept in that bedroom, I don't know. But top and tail, we just made it work. But those were the amazing moments because it built our characters. We, you know, understood each other. We understood how to play. We understood so many different things in terms of our social makeup. And if you think about children and young people now and the way in which they grow up, they're quite disconnected from a lot of their families.
Right.
You know, people are scattered in different parts of the country. Your parents are working, you know, your grandparents have got things doing. So that kind of consistency around being around family is not the way in which we see families or seen families traditionally. And then the next thing I oftentimes talk about is things like community history. When I was growing up, there was a very strong sense of community. When I was growing up, there was a strong sense of the Caribbean community, the Irish community. And a lot of the youth and community provisions that were available to us when we were growing up was led by those particular groups of individuals. So for us, the strong presence of the Rastafarian community, and then the Irish community, where we used to do a lot of stuff at some of the churches in the area. So whether we attended these places or not, but we used to attend their provisions. I remember going to Boys Brigade Club on a Friday night and they took us camping. And then I remember going to another area within Birmingham known as Hockley Port. And that was another provision where a lot of individuals used to attend. And in those particular spaces, we spoke a lot about ourselves. We spoke a lot about our identity. We spoke a lot about our history. We spoke a lot about where do we sit within the context of understanding history in context to where we are. We reasoned quite a lot. And you think about young people right now, they don't have any connections or understanding about who they are and where they're coming from. I was speaking to a young person the other day and they were saying that they were, from the Caribbean, from Jamaica. And I was like, what parish? Didn't know. Speaking to a young Irish boy, told me he's from Ireland. Where are you from? I don't know. I just know that I'm from Ireland. Yeah, but where? Northern Ireland, Dublin? Don't know. So there's a disconnection with our young people. Then we also have to start look at elders, present elders. Historically, there was always present elders. Earlier on, we were talking about wisdom. We were talking about intergenerational knowledge, passing forth those gems that will enable us to be able to go into the future with things that would help us to be resilient, help us to deal with some of the stresses and the things that we may be impacted by in the times moving forward. And you think about the current generation, look at the ages of our young people, look at the ages of grandparents now, and those folk tales and those stories, it's almost missing a generation because the families are increasingly getting younger and younger and younger. And I think that it's important that we think about that within context. And that's just a snapshot of some of the stuff that I talk about within the research. But I think looking at things traditionally and where we are now, fundamentally different. And as I said, we're talking about social media now. We don't have, rites of passage anymore. When we think about historically, there was always things that, throughout the ages that, young men and young women would do in order to be acknowledged by the village. There is no village. So the rites of passage may be the things that we see young people doing on social media platforms. The rites of passage may be the things that we see young people doing in the community that we don't like and we don't agree with. Who remembers things like happy slapping? Who remembers, things where young people would do things in order to get a buzz or a like? And we've seen this now. We're seeing young females now on social media platforms, having sex with multiple individuals in order to get likes. We're seeing young people now killing themselves to get a watch, killing themselves to get a chain, killing themselves just to get some level of material so they can be seen, so they can be heard, so they can be liked. And it's about understanding that in context, that when we're thinking about the families of today versus the families of yesterday, I think these are the challenges that we have as a society to worry and concern about. Well, what should we be pushing and instilling and breathing life into the children of the future so that they can hold on to some of those cultures and those morals that will enable them to, not necessarily be led astray.
Yeah, that's deep. There's a couple of things that I'd like to pick up on what you said there, a couple of points in what you said there. So going back to community, and you also mentioned the disconnection, and it's something you've spoken on before in terms of the disconnection with history, that a lot of our youth don't know their history, which you alluded to earlier, shows where our power is, the Maroons, etc. And there's that also that disconnection with the wider community, in terms of feeling unseen, feeling unheard. What do you think is the importance of having that connection with the history and, being seen and being heard? And if we're not seen and not heard, apart from when maybe you're in a shop and the security guard's watching you, or you're walking down the street and people are holding their bags, if that's the only time you feel seen and heard, if the only thing you know about your history is slavery, how do we overcome this? What's the next steps from your perspective?
And I love this topic, often because I talk about history so much. And I always say that history is so important because it's an opportunity for us to see where we've come from and understand where we are today. And I always talk about history because I think it's a critical discussion that I think that young people should be having. But it's also, what history are we referring to? History is an interesting concept. We talk about history, but oftentimes it's from the lens of servitude. It's not from the lens of power and legacy. So when I talk about history, I think about, ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt. I think about, empires. I think about significant individuals of history that have built and brought culture, mathematics, brought agriculture to civilizations. That's what I think about when I refer to history. But if what's taught oftentimes within the education system, and sometimes from ignorant individuals that don't know about their history, it's taught from a position of asking for your rights, asking to be seen as a human being, asking to be seen as an equal. That may taint the way in which you view yourself as an individual moving forward. So when I consider history and when I think about history, I'm thinking about those amazing human beings that walk the earth. That's what I think about. I think about the amazing people, for those that are of faith, and think about prophets and messengers. And I think about those things when I think about history. What was it about those individuals? What was it about, those men and women that walked the earth? And they all came with a level of power and intellect. They all came with a very certain knowledge of self. And I think that becomes really important to understand that there is a disconnection. And that disconnection oftentimes is taught when we think about systemic racism, when we think about white supremacy, when we think about the way in which education is oftentimes taught. It's taught within a particular way that by default makes our children and young people think that they come from a default position. And I think that default position is instrumental when we look at their self-esteem, when we're looking at their mental health, when we're looking at their self-care, but also their wider understanding about the others. So because I know I came from power, because I know I came from individuals that were seen as leaders of society, when I walk within the community, I don't care what people think in terms of the stereotypes that many people would hold about me, because I know I come from greatness. Whereas I also wonder for a lot of our young people that are not taught that level of greatness or wasn't in a position where they had access to learn about that greatness, I oftentimes wonder, and I think that when we talk about a lot of our young people, and I think we have to talk about this level of mental health as well, I think a lot of our young Black men are struggling. And the data and statistics tell us about suicide ideation, suicide, self-harming, over-sexualized behaviors, substance misuse, alcohol misuse. And I think these things tell us that a lot of our young people, predominantly young Black men that I often work with, are struggling. But where is the point that they can utilize to have as a reference point to say that this is what we're coming from? And even though we're here right now, we can get to that. So is it a conversation about us as we're becoming the elders now of the community? Is it about us in terms of how we're conveying information to the generation of young men? Or is it that the young people need to also take accountability and utilize what they have access to, which is technology and social media, to utilize that to get the information? But there's so much information out there, and there's also so much misinformation out there. So we can somewhat be quite confusing for a lot of individuals when they're trying to make sense of that knowledge of self. And that's why, to your earlier question about mentorship, becomes really important, because then it's about how can you use individuals that probably do the boring stuff like me, that read all of the books, and I can package it in a way in which is going to help you. So a young person that's in the community that's saying, listen, I do want to have a knowledge of myself, I do want to know my identity, but right about now, I'm just trying to get a job. Right about now, I'm dealing with the fact that this particular street have these groups of individuals that seem to have a problem with people that live on the street that I live in. I'm not involved. I just want to get to where I need to get to and not get caught up. How can that information help and guide me to that particular point? So I'll go back to my question. Is that about people like myself and others that are instrumental within our community, that study history, study anthropology, study things that enable us to have a better understanding about our histories? Or is it about young people taking accountability about how they can utilize information in a world of misinformation? Or is it both? And I think that this is where it becomes so important when we're having conversations about history. Where does it fit within the context of society today?
As a criminologist, what has been the most disturbing or eye-opening revelation you've had about the human mind?
I think one of the most disturbing revelations I had was probably my early days as a criminologist, when I was looking at violence amongst young men. And one of the things that became apparent, which also links to some of the work that I do around child sexual exploitation, was that individuals that were exploiting kids around drugs, there are a number of cases that we had reviewed where young males were sexually abusing other young males. And that was seen as punishment. That was seen as get back. And I guess as a Black male, using Black criminology as a lens to make sense of the things that was going on within my local community is a very taboo subject also. When you let people know that these are the things that were being revealed, you also have to be very mindful in the communities that you're working, because the natural thing that most people do in the communities that I serve are going to deny and say it doesn't exist, that don't happen. It's a bit of a stretch to say that those things are happening. But one of the revelations that for me was shocking was how frequent that these things were ultimately happening. And then having to work within the community with certain families where these things had happened, and how do you help and support a victim, essentially, when that victim doesn't want to go to the police, when that victim doesn't want to tell their story, when that victim is very conscious that if they tell somebody and it gets out into the local community, it potentially can bring other levels of shame and guilt and things of that nature. But it's interesting because the same thing happens with young women in our community, young Black women in our community. When they're domestically abused, when they're sexually abused, it's almost like, again, this kind of weird taboo subject that within our community, we don't talk up against these things. But even deeper than that, the individuals within the community that many are aware of that behave like this, we don't hold them accountable. Because maybe the worry is because of our proximity within our local community, that if somebody was to find out, there's a level of danger that may come with that, especially if individuals that are domestically violent, those that are sexually abusing our young women in our community, because they're known, there is a worry or concern that something may happen to them. So for me, that's probably one of the biggest revelations, but also quite difficult with the team that we have, supporting, young people and their families to try and navigate that.
Can you speak a bit about the media and why they only portray the individual's actions and they don't take the holistic into account? And if there's anything else that you want to speak on about misconceptions.
I think it is definitely a misconception. I think the root of, when we think about media, tabloids, when there's something that's happened as a trigger, a massive issue has happened, oftentimes media want to portray the most sensational, romantic, the thing that's going to get hits, the things that's going to get people reading, sort of have a crazy line saying murderer on, the streets, or, young man, youngest killer in the country. And those things are going to get people watching and listening and observing that particular thing. So when we're talking about criminal experts, I always find that an interesting term, because expert in what? people who call themselves a criminal expert but not have no background in understanding crime at all. And then you've got people like myself that may be academics that also have frontline practice, but then you've got just the academics. Then you've got individuals that are from the community. And an interesting label may be that they're all criminal experts. But I think it's also important to understand that many individuals like myself have been trained and taught to look at crime in a holistic way. So it may look at the socioeconomic background of the child that becomes the youngest of committing this particular crime, whereas the tabloid only want to focus on the crime itself. So there is a definite misconception on who is the voice of the explanation of what's going on, but it's also about the level of rigor that media entities go through in order to get that level of information. But if you think about the type of papers that are out there, if you read something from The Independent versus something in the Sun newspaper, it's not the same. The Independent will probably use, for example, a criminal expert, whereas the Sun may just get somebody from the local community that may be volunteering and saying they're a criminal expert. So you're going to have two completely different views on what the situation is essentially unfolding. And I think that then becomes really, really important, because I've been in situations before where I've been interviewed by a paper talking about music and social media, and the question is social media and is music videos the thing that's causing our young people to increasingly be involved in gangs and knife crime? And I've given a holistic way of explaining some of the issues and the tensions and the way in which things are questioned and put out there, and I've only used 2 lines. So a viewer that's reading that says criminal expert Craig Pinkney, for example, you're going to be like, what's this guy talking about? Because there's loads of factors around poverty and deprivation and mental health and lack of opportunity and absence, this and you're going to present that as an argument. But I may have had that conversation with the person that was interviewing, but they've chose to only use the sensational parts of that. But then also, as I said, you're going to have individuals that don't know anything. And oftentimes those are the individuals that are put in the forefront, of the media to speak on behalf of a situation or an incident that oftentimes hasn't been studied, or they don't have a clue what they're talking about.
Right. And they're put there because they serve the agenda of that media outlet.
100%.
So what do you think, if anything, needs to change about the way we study and talk about crime?
I think new insights are always good. I always talk about bridging the gap between academia and the streets. That's one of my strap lines, bridging that gap. So it's not just about being, an academic, because we know loads of academics are just academics, and nothing wrong with that. But I also know loads of people that work within community, and it's not just about being in the community. I say that we need to align them. We need to, bring those things together that enable us to have an understanding of what's going on within our communities, that we can bring forth strategies. But it's also about that frontline experience and then aligning that so we kind of have that passion plus intellect in what we do. But I think it's also about calling out laziness. I think it's also about calling out individuals that what is oftentimes called within the world of academia, people that sit from the ivory tower, and all they do is they look down on the individuals that are on the ground, and then they make assertions and they do data on these individuals without going down to actually understand the real life and lived experiences of those individuals. And I tend to do both. So I speak from a particular position that enables me to be able to kind of articulate in a particular way. So when people hear it, they know that it's academic, but they also know that it's rooted within community. And we need more of that. And it means that people need to essentially do the work. They can't just constantly keep exploiting communities for information in order to make themselves look good on a pedestal or for those economic means or whatever it may be that people are trying to achieve.
How do you protect your mental health and burnout dealing with, so much trauma and emotions that you have to deal with in your line of work?
I think it's a hard thing to protect, especially when you're dealing with families where that family may have lost their child to quite horrific circumstances. A family that may have lost their child to the criminal justice system, a family that has lost their child to mental health services, where they feel like they've lost their child. And then dealing with the day-to-day challenges of community. Everybody wanting answers to their problems, with the assumption that all of the answers, and oftentimes I don't. Then you got to deal with the day-to-day things that young people present, whether that is them navigating through life, things that they're witnessing or observing on social media platforms. And the time when they present it to you, you may feel that you don't have the resource to help them in the moment other than words, and that sometimes leaves you feeling a bit helpless. So it's a lot. In the work that we do, many individuals like myself are quite big empaths. And we absorb the pain, the trauma, the chaos, the noise that exists within communities. So protecting one's mental health should be important. But I think there's also there's a massive danger if you're not aware of what the triggers, what the things that exist within the community that can potentially create an environment where you start really doing things that is kind of outside of your nature. So for myself, I train a lot. That helps. I go to the gym quite a lot. I structure my week in a way in which enables me to have reflection. So it may appear that I work a lot, but I've got an amazing team that enable me to have a couple of days where I'm just being Craig. Whether I choose to do self-care on that particular day, I have sometimes a massage. I travel a lot. I like to observe animals. I like to do silly things with my children. I like to see my nan on my days where I'm not doing anything. And I think that is also rooted in trauma within family as well. I lost my auntie in 2021, and I don't feel like I've recovered from that. So my nan's been the inspiration, the person that enables me to process and to be silly and be that 17-year-old Craig that my nan's always cussing. I like that. I love that. And I enjoy my weekends being with my nan and just eating and just being silly with my nan. But I also have access to a therapist as well, which I found therapy quite difficult. I have moments where I'm enjoying it, I'm learning so much about myself. And then I have moments where I feel like I don't want to go. Maybe because my therapist asks me a whole bunch of questions that I don't like and really uncomfortable. I know in my mind that there's reason and there's the importance of doing it, but I don't like the feeling of it. And I guess those things are the things that I do, but I also mentioned that there's a privilege with a lot of the things that I've just mentioned. Some people don't have the ability to jump on a plane and just go whenever they please. Some people don't have the money to pay for a therapist that may cost 70, 80 pounds per session. Some people don't have the ability to go to the gym and do the things that I do. They may not have the privilege of having, people that, like a grandparent that's still alive that, can be so, silly and give them so much wisdom because they may not necessarily have, a mental capacity to be able to do those things or the physicality to be able to do the things that I do with mine. So I do speak with all of those experiences, but I also like to remind people of privilege. I don't ever like to speak in a way that doesn't acknowledge the fact that I'm blessed. And I'm in a position where I can, do these things. But I also worry that there's so many within our community that may not necessarily have that privilege, and they can't do that. And I think that may help to understand why many of us are struggling right now.
But a lot of people say attention is the new currency. So what role does clout chasing and likes on social media play into violence?
I like that statement or strap line, but I've always said that attention has always been the currency.
Mm.
It's what's rooted in the human experience. It's kind of one of our basic needs. We want to be seen, we want to be heard. I think the context in the way in which people want to be seen and heard in today's society is very different. And we look at social media, and this is very much what my PhD study is ultimately all about. It looks at the correlation between social media, music, violence within the context of the West Midlands. And one of the things that I talk about within my work, and I've also done a paper on this, looks at how social media platforms create narcissistic tendencies. And I also say we shouldn't always just point the finger at young people. We also should talk about multinational corporations and marketing and big business that comes into this idea that they want people on these platforms talking about themselves. You think of Snapchat, you talk about Instagram, you look at TikTok and all of these things. What is it about? Look at me, look at me, look at me, look at me, look at me. Attention. So whilst people are on those particular platforms, what sometimes happens is individuals sometimes forget and they get lost in the source. So when you say attention is the new currency, the currency is to be seen. The currency is to be acknowledged. The currency is to be liked more than everybody else. And on a social media platform, if you're liked the most, what do you then have the opportunity to get? Blue tick. So you get yourself a blue tick now on something like Instagram. It suggests that you're popular. It suggests that you're somebody of significance. So you have those things going on a social media platform. And then you've got people that essentially are looking, thinking, well, I want to be like that. So then when you talk about clout, people are now just doing anything now on social media platforms just to get a hit, just to get a like, just to get some sort of, viral moment. And I guess whilst people are essentially doing that, they're losing themselves within that. And I said this earlier on about the people, unfortunately, that are on social media platforms, and it's damaging, whether it's young men, pushing for very hyper masculine, misogynistic ways in which they should demonstrate their manhood, versus young women that are talking about so-called empowerment, but then sleeping with hundreds and hundreds of men.
So how can we redirect that hunger for attention towards something more positive?
It's multi-layered. One of the things I talk about within my work a lot also is you have to discover your lane. I don't want to talk and suggest that there is a solution to the problem, because also the question sometimes alludes to the fact that you doing one thing is going to solve the problem. There's multi things that people can do. So one of the things that we do in our organization is about education, building resilience, helping people discover themselves and their identity, with the hope that when they are interacting with these mediums through a mediatized space, that they're making the right decisions. And as I said earlier on, that there is a lot of positive that can come out of social media platforms. There are so many benefits that people can grasp and get from that. We've been talking about mentorship today. We've been talking about podcasting. We've been talking about interviews. We've been talking about the right information as opposed to misinformation. So there's loads that social media and media generally can contribute to the upliftment of individuals and people. It's about when people utilize it incorrectly and improper in a way in which causes the tensions. And my worry is for those individuals that are, trying to discover themselves, or they're, lacking self-esteem, or they don't know who they are, or they don't know their purpose, and they may come into contact with individuals or groups that utilize social media for a negative purpose and somehow coerce and manipulate, or even using the word brainwashing them into things that potentially they go into that may have an adverse impact on them or their families. So education is my lane. I think that there needs to be more education around knowledge of self. I think there needs to be more education about identity. I think there needs to be more education about, who people are. Self-exploration for me is really important. And I just don't think that we do enough of that type of stuff. So education for me is important, but I think also individuals that are in the realm of, mental health and supporting people around their well-being. I think there's loads of work around where the arts can do really well. People that are into drama, the people that are using, art generally as forms of therapy and helping people to, articulate the ways in which they think and they feel. Sport is also an amazing tool. Individuals that are in the health industry, in the fitness industry. There's so many ways in which you can help and support. I think my lane for me is education, and how can we utilize education as a means to engage young people.
So we spoke earlier about media labeling youths and for their own agenda.
Yeah.
We also spoke about how youths want to be part of something, and they're part of groups. Sometimes it's not even gangs. Sometimes it might be groups before it turns to a gang. Yeah. Some of these young people are just scared, and they're holding knives and weapons because they're scared of not having one.
Yeah.
So with these mislabeling of youths that are just dealing with their environment and their circumstances, how does that affect the youths themselves?
It's a complex question. And I guess the way in which I oftentimes like to explain this, as you mentioned, young people that may carry knives, for example, that may be scared. I always talk about the things that we see within our local communities, where young people may increasingly be joining gangs or carrying weapons. I always say that there's 3 categories of young people. And I would say the first category of young people that may carry weapons or join groups because they're scared. They watch, hear, and observe things going on within their community. Also things they watch online, the things that are in films and in games that tells them a narrative that the environments amongst young people are scary. So therefore the narrative is you need to protect yourself. And then you've got a second category of young people that carry weapons because they've got, actual beef and tensions with individuals. So they carry the weapons with the intention that if they see these individuals or see people that they've got problems with, they're going to do something about it. There's also another category of young people that watch and observe the things that are going on online, and it's become this weird part of youth culture that it's cool and fashionable to carry weapons and to want to assimilate or to align yourself with a particular postcode, area code, or group. But with all of those different categories, the way in which people externally look at this group is that they're all one particular group anyway. So oftentimes a label that's given to children and young people, oftentimes internalized by those young people. There's, not to get too academic on you, but labeling theory is a thing. When you tell somebody something over and 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 over again, people internalize those particular narratives and then they become the thing that you're saying. And it's funny because I work with a lot of children and young people that are on the spectrum of ADHD. And I remember working in one school, and this young man is always told that because of his ADHD, he behaves in this particular way. And I never forget, he threw some chairs. I didn't know what the situation was. I just went into the building at the time, and he was kicking off. And I remember him being in the corridor, and I said to him, what was that all about earlier on? So that's because I got ADHD. And I smiled because that was his first response. So the rationale for why he did what he did is because he believes that everything that he's doing is because of his ADHD. And I work with children and young people on the spectrum and neurodiverse, that are neurodiverse. And it's funny because whenever he was in my session, he never threw any chairs. So when are we picking and choosing when the ADHD? Of course it's present. But the point I'm making is that labels can have a significant impact in the way in which children and young people behave. Also, when we talk about the damaging of the label, when it's racialized, when it's gendered, because there's also an agenda. And when you see how that gets played out within mental health services, education, criminal justice systems, community as it relates to stop and search, these labels have an impact. So you may have a young person, for example, my son, that's 15 years old, walking in the community. He's black. He's walking around in the clothes that young people generally wear from the same place that everybody else buys their clothes. And there may be a perception with him walking on the road that he may be this label. Now, if he then gets approached and treated in a manner that's not befitting, that may have a significant impact on the way in which he thinks and how he feels towards the entity that's stopping him. And that might be the police, that may be a random group of people on the street, or it might be someone from the community that's also scared of young people, that thinks that my son that's walking up the road is doing something wrong. And I think that labels become really important, and us understanding about how we unpack those labels, but also what we do to challenge what those labels mean in the lives of our children and young people.